Our next speaker was born and raised in Stockton, California, and at the very young age of 26 became the first African American and youngest mayor of Stockton, California. Can we please welcome Michael Tubbs?
I absolutely hate the holiday of Halloween. And I have a sweet tooth. I know for many people, Halloween is about dressing up and trick-or-treating and being in community. But for me, 7 years ago, Halloween became synonymous with anger, with pain, with a sense of nihilism. November 1st, 2010 started like any other day. I was 20 years old, and I was so honored to be an intern in the Obama White House. So I woke up early, way too early for my taste, to make sure I got into the office on time, because Ms. Jarrett liked her clips bright and early. And while there, my mom has a tendency to text, call, and email me incessantly, but it was different when I was at the White House. She respected it. She said, you know what, I'll wait till you get home. And then I get a call from my mom. Now I looked at it and I said, well, she would never call me at such an important job, so let me answer it. And my mom generally doesn't cry, but there was something different in her voice that day. It was barely above a whisper, and she had told me that my cousin Donnell James had been murdered at a house party in Stockton the night before on Halloween. So in that moment, I was angry. I was upset. I had this sense of powerlessness and nihilism, and also a sense of futility. What was the point of being at Stanford or being at the White House when my own cousin was murdered back home in my hometown? Flying back to Stockton, the same feeling stuck with me. And then I realized that that narrative was not just a narrative of my family or my cousin, but of far too many young men of color and communities throughout this nation. Of far too many young men of color and communities throughout this nation. So going to the funeral, being upset, being angry, I sat down and had a conversation with my family and with God about where do we move from here? Because I think oftentimes when bad things happen, when things don't go our way, when everything's not perfect, it's easy to sit in anger. It's much more difficult to drive towards action. So I had a conversation with my mother. I said, Mom, how do we move from pain to purpose? There has to be a bigger lesson in here for the family in this. And she said, well, you have a couple options. You could continue on the path you're going and make a lot of money. So we had a conversation about whether it was more important for me at 20, 21 years old to make change or make dollars. And for some people, that's funny, but for us, it was real, because we were poor and not doing much better now. So it was a real consideration. The second thing we had to consider, being 21 years old, coming of age in the time of social media, was this idea, was my fear of embarrassment greater than my love for the people? Meaning that if I decide to step up, decide to run for office, all my Facebook rants, and I didn't listen to the First Lady's advice then, so my Twitter rants at 20 years old, all those things will become public knowledge and political fodder. And oftentimes, when you put yourself out there as a public figure, you also make yourself a public target. So that's the second thing I had to consider. The third thing I had to consider came from one of my favorite sermons from Dr. King. He talked about the Good Samaritan parable, and he said the Good Samaritan was special because everyone else thought what would happen to them if they helped the man on the side of the road. And he said the Good Samaritan flipped that question and said, if I don't help, what happens to them? So the other folks were like, what would happen to me, my wants, my sacrifices? But the Good Samaritan said, what would happen to them if I don't help? And then the last kind of question I had to ask myself was this question of charity versus justice. Because at that time, I thought I was doing a lot of good things. I was running nonprofits, I was doing programs, I was speaking at fundraisers, I was doing all these charity things. And then after the death of my cousin and examining kind of the structural violence in communities throughout this nation that make it so young people oftentimes don't get the opportunity to sit where we sit, nor reach their full potential, necessitates something a little bit more in justice. So me and my friends had this debate, like, is it about charity or is it about justice? And I came to the conclusion that for me, Charity is necessary, but it's not sufficient to create the world that we want to create. When kids are growing up in communities with limited opportunity, that some of us have to step up, get in the arena, and be like Solange and demand a seat at the table. So in 2012, at 21 years old, with no money, even less experience, I decided to be motivated by the death of my cousin and to run for city council in Stockton, California. Stockton's a city of 315,000 people. It has a lot of assets, but also, like many communities, had some real structural issues to deal with. And running wasn't easy. There was no guarantee that we would win, but now being in the room where it happens, like Lin-Manuel said, provides an opportunity to again put purpose to that pain and to articulate policy solutions that come not just from something I read, but from things I lived. And I share that because I know you all out there have that same lived experience, that same passion, and maybe you just need someone to tell you to run. So run. And 5 years later, so many things have happened in the great all-American city of Stockton, California. We're not perfect, everything's not fixed, but in 5 years, by listening, we've been able to close down problem liquor stores and establish fresh produce for folks in my old neighborhood. In 5 years, we've been able to bring in the first bank to the underserved parts of the community. In the last 50 years, in 5 years, we've been able to start and pilot a universal basic income demonstration, and now we're working on the college promise. And all this good work didn't just happen. It took people. It took someone stepping up and saying, you know what, I may not have any money, may not have all the answers, but I have a lot of anger, a lot of pain, and how to put purpose to that and do something with it. So I started 7 years ago, and I went in there. So after the death of my cousin and my internship in the White House, I was on another journey on the Freedom Rides with some of the original Freedom Riders. And one guy, Bob Singleton, he said two things that stuck with me that I want to leave with us, because I think they really speak to the point of this convening. The first thing Mr. Singleton said, and what was shocking, he was 20 years old when he got on that bus. And for some reason, maybe because I'm slow, I thought he was 70 when he got on the bus, and 70 again in 2010. And then I did the math, and he was actually 20. And he said he had a decision to make. He said there were a lot of great moments in the civil rights movement, but he said it took collective impact and collective power to change those moments into a movement. And he said, what are you going to do? And then he said, I was arrested on August 4th, 1961. Michael, why is that day important? And I said, well, you were arrested, and if you weren't arrested, I wouldn't be on this bus, and we wouldn't be having this 50-year reunion. And then he rolled his eyes, and he said something very powerful. He said, on that day, Barack Hussein Obama was born. And he said he had no idea, as a 20-year-old with no power, less opportunity than we have now, with the wholly segregated system, the choice he made at 20 years old would pave the way so a child just being born will have the chance to be president 50 years later. And then he looked at me and left me with a question that motivates me every day, and I think should motivate all of us. The first one is, was this summit just a moment, or is it a catalyst to a global movement of reclaiming our time, our communities, and making our world look like what it should? And the final question is this: what are we prepared to do today so that 50 years from now, a child born on November 1st, 2017 has every opportunity we've had and even more? Thank you.